Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Dwight Eisenhower, and the focus is beginning to govern the middle way president. The year is 1952. Ike is the president-elect of the United States. He's starting to put his team together, and he starts at the top of the cabinet with John Foster Dulles, who'd basically been preparing his whole career to be Secretary of State. He finally gets that opportunity. Ike had a number of very accomplished people in his cabinet, including Attorney Herb Brownell. Brownell had been so helpful during the campaign. He's now going to be Attorney General. George Humphrey, also accomplished in business. He's taking over at the Treasury Department. Humphrey would actually become Ike's closest friend in the cabinet, but he also had his personal staff to take care of, and beginning with what he called the Chief of Staff. Just like he had as Supreme Allied Commander, well, he wanted a Chief of Staff in the White House, the first time that title had been used, to bring some discipline back to the Oval Office. And for this, he went with someone who was very similar to his Chief of Staff from the war, Beadle Smith. He went to the New Hampshire Governor, Sherman Adams, who actually had been with him very much during the campaign. And like Smith, Adams was blunt to the point of rudeness, but Ike liked him because he was loyal, he worked incredibly hard, and he was extremely effective. Adams taking over as the first White House Chief of Staff. Now, Ike had made a campaign commitment late in the campaign that if he won election, he would go to Korea, at least to figure out what was going on there firsthand, see if he could figure out a way to bring that war to an end. And so on November the 29th, in a secret mission, he's off to Korea for a 3-day fact-finding tour, meeting with the troops, flying over the front lines in a helicopter, and of course meeting with the leaders like Mark Clark, who he had known for years. They'd worked together both before, during World War II, and Clark's now the commander in Korea, and Clark says, look, Ike, you're in charge here. Let's double down. Let's go into the North. Let's win this war, because they'd sort of been at a stalemate for more than a year now around the 38th parallel, and Clark thought with Ike coming into the presidency, it's a chance to really double down, maybe even use nuclear weapons in the North and go win this war. And Ike told him, you know what, that's not really going to happen. He told Clark, I know just how you feel militarily, but I feel I have a mandate from the people to stop this fighting. That's my decision. He didn't have any answers yet as to how he was going to stop the fighting, but the goal was clear. For the Korean War, his goal was to end it kind of as soon as he could. Inauguration Day was a little bit rough, in part because of Eisenhower's attitude. Eisenhower and Harry Truman, the incumbent president, really bitter over the campaign. And when Ike got to the White House on Inauguration Day, traditionally the incumbent president would invite the president-elect in, have a bite to eat, have some tea, something like that, and Truman extended the invitation, and Eisenhower basically said, no, I'm going to sit in the car. When you're ready, you get in the car, we'll go to the Capitol together, which was pretty petty. Truman was really upset about it. Truman got in the car eventually, and they went to the Capitol, basically didn't say anything to each other on that ride over, and their relationship was effectively over. But Ike put it behind him, and he was ready to take his oath from Chief Justice Fred Vinson and give his inaugural remarks, which focused on the unique situation that the United States found itself in during this Cold War period. So we are persuaded by necessity and by belief that the strength of all free peoples lies in unity, their danger in discord. To produce this unity, to meet the challenge of our time, destiny has laid upon our country the responsibility of the free world's leadership. And that was a leadership position that Ike personally took very seriously. He got to work on day one, putting his new structure in place, again, having some order and discipline in the Oval Office like he had been when he was Supreme Allied Commander. But he also actually realized that he'd never been in politics before. He's now President of the United States, but things really weren't all that different for him. He wrote in his diary on day one that my first day at the president's desk, plenty of difficult problems, but such has been my portion for a long time. The result is that this just seems today like a continuation of all I've been doing since July of 1941, and even before that, he felt ready to do this job as President of the United States. National security is his number one priority and would remain so throughout his time as president, and he had to deal with the standoff with the communists in Europe, which he knew all too well, not only from the war, but recently serving as the NATO commander, trying to stand up the Mutual Defense Alliance in Europe, and of course the war in Korea, with his goal is to end this thing. An opening occurred on March the 5th, shortly into Ike's tenure, when Joseph Stalin, the premier of the Soviet Union, died. And the hawks in the administration thought this could be an opening to double down. Again, maybe use nuclear weapons and win in the North. Maybe there's a power vacuum in the Soviet Union. Let's take advantage of this. And Ike was saying no. His middle way was to bring this thing to an end. After all, it's been a stalemate for more than a year now at around the 38th parallel, and this is basically, as Ike thought, mission accomplished. That was our goal, was to check the communists at the 38th parallel, keep the war contained within Korea, no launching of World War III here, and basically that had been accomplished. And so he wanted to engage with the new leader for the Soviet Union, who temporarily was Georgy Malenkov, and there was an opening when Ike actually then gave a speech. He called it the Chance for Peace speech. This is on April the 16th. The endless spending in this arms race wasn't helping any country. He put his marker on the table that he said the worst thing that can happen these days is atomic war. But even the best would be this, a life of perpetual fear and tension, a burden of armies draining the wealth and labor of all peoples, a wasting of strength that defies the American system or the Soviet system or any system to achieve abundance and happiness. We got to get out of this endless cycle, and maybe bringing peace to Korea would be a chance to do it. So the peace talks resumed and the prisoner exchange occurred, which was really a positive sign coming from both sides. It turned out that maybe the biggest obstacle to getting to peace was the head of the South Korea, Syngman Rhee. His goal was still to unify North and South Korea under his leadership. Again, he's encouraging the Americans to take the fight above the 38th parallel, but Eisenhower's saying flat out no. In fact, Rhee, if you don't go along with this armistice, I'm just going to pull my troops out. Rhee obviously at that point had no leverage, and so he gave in. July the 27th, the armistice was signed. Only about 6 months into Eisenhower's tenure, he did what he said he was going to do. He ended this unpopular war. It was basically, again, didn't get everything he wanted or that the United States wanted, but essentially mission was accomplished. Most importantly for Eisenhower, he could report to the American people that this war was over. We have shown in the winning of this truce that the collective resolve of the free world can and will meet aggression in Asia or anywhere in the world. Ike's favorability at this point jumped to 73%. Now, this was not going to be typical party politics for Eisenhower, including from his middle way. He was going to have obstacles on the Democratic side, the other side of the aisle, but also on his own side with the conservatives and the isolationist wing of the Republican Party. And this was his job, was, as he saw it, the middle way was to avoid both of those extremes. He explained it this way: when I refer to the middle way, I merely mean the middle way as it represents a practical working basis between extremists, both of whose doctrines I flatly reject. Anything that affects or is proposed for masses of humans is wrong if the position it seeks is at either end of possible argument. He was going to take a different approach. Now, partisan government was a fact of life. He was going to have challenges from sort of, again, both sides, including within the Republican Party, because Robert Taft, who he had beaten out for the Republican nomination in the previous year, was the Senate Majority Leader, and Taft wanted to get out of all these other obligations around the world. He was an isolationist. He wanted to cut that budget deeply, and Eisenhower said, look, I'm in favor of a balanced budget, but I'm not going to cut it to the level that you want. That would put national security at risk, and I'm not an isolationist. I'm not just going to pull out of all these areas. And so they went at it a little bit early in Ike's tenure as president, but they actually found a way to get along, and the game of golf actually helped. He and Taft actually became friends on the golf course, and it actually made them more productive in trying to work together. It was one of the reasons why Ike was so distraught when just 5 months into his term, Taft died from stomach cancer, and that left him with a new majority leader who was even further to the right and less willing to compromise. That was the new majority leader from California, William Knowland. And his middle way is going to be pretty hard. Again, he's got the Democrats on one side, Knowland on the other. He's already starting to feel early in his term some kind of endless battles within the administration, including coming from his own Republicans. He said, we're getting exceedingly tired of having people in Congress who are supposed to be supporting us engage in kicking our shins and bickering. Well, one area where Knowland was not going to do anything was in one of the most controversial areas the country was facing as part of the Red Scare, anti-communism being led by Senator Joseph McCarthy. Now, with the Republicans winning the majority in the Senate, that meant that McCarthy is now a chairman of the Government Operations Committee and the chair of the Subcommittee on Investigations. That meant he had a budget, that meant he had subpoena power, and he was going to ramp up his demagoguery, accusations often without evidence, putting people in the crosshairs, ruining careers, ruining lives, often without evidence. Sort of his techniques were odious to Eisenhower, but Eisenhower also recognized that there was an important element here. If there were subversives in the government, we got to find them and get rid of them. So again, he's trying to find a middle way, which is very difficult to do with somebody like Joe McCarthy. The one thing that Eisenhower was not going to do is what Harry Truman did. Truman tried to use the bully pulpit to attack McCarthy, and Eisenhower thought that whole strategy was a mistake. He said that I really believe that nothing will be so effective in combating his particular kind of troublemaking as to ignore him. This he cannot stand. He later said, I will not get in the gutter with that guy. Ike was saying we got to be patient. Give McCarthy enough rope and he'll hang himself. Now, this was a correct strategy in the long run. There was a lot of suffering in the meantime while Ike was going through his sort of patient middle way, especially when McCarthy put his hearings on national television, but Ike was not going to engage McCarthy directly in a strategy that eventually worked its way out. Things actually came to a head when McCarthy went after Eisenhower's U.S. Army. There was a dentist by the name of Irving Peress who was actually discharged. He was a draftee, and he was discharged when he refused to take his loyalty oath, but for some reason he had actually been promoted just before he was let go. And McCarthy was outraged at this promotion. He called to his committee Brigadier General Ralph Zwicker, who was a war hero with the Silver Star and Purple Heart, and Zwicker didn't have very satisfactory answers from McCarthy, who lashed out at him. He said, you don't have the brains of a 5-year-old. You are a disgrace to the uniform you wear. Well, Ike was outraged about this, as was Army Secretary Robert Stevens. Said, you can't treat our soldiers that way. So they went to the Attorney General and they started talking about it. What can we do to prevent this from happening again? Well, Eisenhower decided the military is not going to testify. Even if they're subpoenaed, they're not going to testify to McCarthy anymore. And then as he thought about it, he said, you know what? We're going to expand that to the entire executive branch. Subpoena away, we're not coming. This was the boldest, most pervasive claim of executive privilege in American history. And Eisenhower explained to the people that this separation is vital to preclude the exercise of arbitrary power by any branch of the government. Question whether it was constitutional or not didn't matter. Ike had put his stake in the ground, but he couldn't stop the hearings. Now, McCarthy wasn't going to get access to people in the executive branch, but he could call other people, and those accusations and the hysterics would continue on national television with Joe McCarthy. So who could actually stop this thing? Well, it turned out that a grandfatherly outside counsel for the Army by the name of Joseph Welch stepped into the breach and really made it different. Typical for McCarthy, what did he do? He went to attack, not Welch necessarily, but Welch's law firm. He found out in his research there was a junior member of that firm by the name of Fred Fisher, who early in his life had been a member of the National Lawyers Guild. Well, what was the National Lawyers Guild? Well, apparently, according to McCarthy, it had some loose ties to the Communist Party, so therefore Fisher's a communist, and that would taint Welch. Well, Welch had learned about this actually early on, this relationship for Fisher. He'd taken him off the case. He had nothing to do with this, and he was emotional in the way he responded to McCarthy, effectively putting him in his place like no one had before. Little did I dream you could be so reckless and so cruel as to do an injury to that lad, Welch said. It is, I regret to say, equally true that I fear he shall always bear a scar, needlessly inflicted by you. If it were in my power to forgive you for your reckless cruelty, I would do so. I like to think I'm a gentleman, but your forgiveness will have to come from someone other than me. And as McCarthy then went back to talking about Fisher, Welch interrupted and said, you've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir, at long last? Have you left no sense of decency? Well, those remarks somehow clicked. McCarthy was starting to come across as a real bully. The country started to react. The press, Edward R. Murrow on his national television program on CBS, took McCarthy to task. Now, a lot of things changed in 1954 when the Republicans lost the majority, so McCarthy lost his gavel anyway, and at that point the Senate was ready to turn on McCarthy as well. They gave him a formal rebuke, a censure in December of 1954, and the vote was 67-22. Not only all the Democrats, but 22 Republicans joined in, and the 4-year reign of McCarthy's reign of terror was now effectively over. Ike's patient approach seemed to work, but again, there was a lot of suffering while he was patiently awaiting for McCarthy to sort of hang himself, which he eventually did, and Welch to come through and bail him out. But it was effective in the end, and McCarthy basically vanished from the scene. Within a couple of years, McCarthy died. National security. Nuclear weapons, still picking up the pace here as the Americans had fired off the first hydrogen bomb, the first fusion-based thermonuclear weapon in 1952. The Soviets were sort of right behind. This arms race was continuing, and it was so costly that Eisenhower is saying, again, the middle way is we have to figure out how to constrain that. He called it the most frustrating domestic problem that he had, the defense budget. You've got the conservatives and the isolationists on one side saying cut, cut, cut. You've got the hawks in the military saying spend, spend, spend. For Ike, middle way. I patiently explain over and over again that American strength is a combination of its economic, moral, and military force. If we demand too much in taxes in order to build planes and ships, we will tend to dry up the accumulations of capital that are necessary to provide jobs for the millions of new workers that we must absorb each year. He introduced his new look defense policy. He was going to double down on nuclear weapons because deterrence was going to be the most important thing. Actually, deterrence more so than defense. What did that mean? A lot of money for the Air Force, for planes, for bombs, nuclear bombs in particular, and for missiles. The goal was what they called massive retaliation. To make it clear to the Soviets, if you come attack us, we're going to obliterate you. Their goal was to have, and they accomplished, 1,000 bombers and 1,000 nuclear weapons that they could deploy at a moment's notice and basically wipe off the face of the earth much of the Soviet Union. This again was the new approach, and it was expensive for the Air Force. But to offset that, he made some tough decisions. He made some cuts to the Navy and deep cuts to the Army. And of course, the Army folks weren't very happy about this, but Eisenhower's position was, look, we have to put our resources where it's going to be the most useful, and for that was in the nuclear weapons, massive retaliation. That was the New Look defense program that he thought was more balanced, part of his middle way. That is Dwight Eisenhower, and beginning to govern, the middle way president, from the life of Dwight Eisenhower. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Chronicles.